They cash out, they declare bankrupt.
It's still very problematic.
The burden will come to them.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Hazwin Hassan. This week we continue to delve into the fuel subsidy rationalisation, picking up from where we left off last week with economist Professor Jeffrey Williams. While experts may argue that the inflationary impact from the blanket diesel subsidy withdrawals will not be so significant on the economy, there are still concerns about rogue traders who may look for this opportunity to hike up prices. We'll discuss enforcement measures by the government to prevent subsidy leakages and safeguard consumers. Are mechanisms such as the monthly 200 ringgit diesel aid and fleet cards robust enough to stop traders from exploiting consumers? This and more in our first segment with the Federation of Malaysian Consumers Association, or FOMCA's Vice President and Legal Advisor, Dato' Indrani Thurai Singham. And in the second half of the show later, I'll be joined by transport consultant and former Land Public Transport Commission, or SPAD, Head of Policy Planning, Wan Agil Wan Hassan, to talk about the just announced mandatory requirement of vehicle entry permits, or VEPs, beginning October 1st later this year for all foreign vehicles entering from Singapore through the Johor border. The VEPs, which have been implemented since 2019, have faced setbacks. But now, Transport Minister Anthony Locke says the government is ready to fully enforce the rule. So will this be the answer to all of the congestion woes down at the CIQ in Johor? Find out later in our second segment. Now first, to talk about the fuel subsidy leakages and enforcement measures against price hikes, I have with me via video call FOMCA Vice President Dato' Indrani Thurai Singham. Dato', welcome to Be on the Headlines.
Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you so much. Now, as far as we know, Dato', the government has made it clear that the subsidy withdrawals will only affect the T20 income group and foreigners. It is not, as the government has stressed, a total removal of subsidized fuel. So in terms of the mechanisms put in place that we already know, how airtight is this, do you think, so far, that we won't get any subsidy leakages?
Yeah, well, I think if we look at some of the statements that the government has made, from what I understand and what we know so far is that there are individuals who have privately owned cars using diesel, and also then I think the smallholders such as the farmers, fisher folks, and livestock breeders, they would still continue to have these diesel subsidies. Plus, I think over and above that, they would also be able to get ringgit 200, if I'm not mistaken, a month as cash transfers. So I think in that sense, we can see that the government is trying to close some of the gaps to ensure that there are no leakages, and also not to have any impact on the consumers. And that's why logistical companies using diesel as well have been given access to the subsidies through the fleet cards, if I'm not mistaken. But I think, of course, the fleet cards would have certain quotas. I would assume that they would have certain quotas in terms of how much of diesel they would be able to consume. Because if not, if there are no limits, and then you would again see leakages, potential leakages, because if certain companies are only using a certain amount, the rest of the amount can be again sold to people who would not be eligible for these subsidies. So I think whatever mechanism that comes in place, there would be unscrupulous quarters who would try again and again to find ways to, either smuggle or to find ways of purchasing the subsidized diesel. And for me, I think that's why I think for the consumer movement, what we always advocate for is the constant surveillance and monitoring that would have to take place when enforcing this rationalization to ensure that whatever subsidy rationalization doesn't impact on the consumers, that the burden is not passed on to the consumers, especially when we're talking about the B40 and the M40 consumers, because there should not be any unjustified price increase in terms of goods and services.
So do you think, as it is now, do you think more preventive measures are needed to ensure that it is airtight and that people, rogue traders, unscrupulous individuals will not attempt to exploit consumers?
Well, as I mentioned, you will always find some errant businessmen trying to make profits. And I think that's why we also then have the Price Control Act that has been put in place, the Price Control Act and Anti-Profiteering, the Price Control and Anti-Profiteering Act of 2011. And this comes under the Ministry of Domestic Trade and Cost of Living. And I think this mechanism, is actually put in place to ensure, number one, that there is some sort of price control element, where in terms of essential items, that the government ensures that there's a maximum price. And then the anti-profiteering element, and I think this is where this would come into play when we're talking about the rationalization of, subsidies. The anti-profiteering element is where it prohibits businesses from making unreasonable high profits. So this is where, you consider factors such as cost of production, looking at market condition, looking at the average profit margin of that particular industry. And then also it looks into issues like the transparency that, businesses must display prices. Many a times now, because of digitalization, most of the time you don't see prices being displayed, because they say, oh, it's all in the barcode, but then you need to have the reading, of the barcodes, the mechanisms there in place. And then, of course, the element of price monitoring, where businesses are supposed to keep records of their pricing structure so that the ministry officials can constantly monitor that whether these mechanisms are in the right place, and and I think there have been just recent cases of of other aspects of oil, subsidized oil being sold to again businesses who are not eligible to get subsidized oil. So I think the Price Control and Anti-Profiteering Act, which is already in place in 2011, plays a very crucial role in ensuring that the consumers are not, their rights are not impinged, or the burden is not passed on to them. Again, you need very strict, monitoring, surveillance as well as enforcement. Not only monitoring and surveillance, but enforcement as well, and prosecution, because it's no use just merely enforcing, but if you don't take cases, and prosecute them, because the law actually provides for prosecution, it provides for fines as well as imprisonment as well. And so the ministry should be able to take up these instances. But what is needed is, at the moment now, we know that the Ministry of Domestic Trade and Cost of Living do not have enough resources. They are, the number of officers, if we are looking at rationalization first in Peninsula, then we need to ensure that in every nook and corner of this peninsula, that there must be stringent monitoring. Because I think the government is trying to see whether if it works in Peninsula, only then they would implement something similar in Sabah and Sarawak. So to ensure that this mechanism, works, we need to ensure very stringent and regular monitoring of, of this rationalization of fuel subsidy, especially in terms of diesel. And these officers must be also be well equipped. They must be able to go and look and see in terms of, you know, whether they have the capacity in terms of if there's going to be an app that, you know, that is going to be put in place, whether, you know, these officers must also be, their capacity must be also built. You know, they must be able to know how to use that particular app. So in terms of technology, in terms of even prosecution, they must be able to know the, how to actually ensure that, you know, in terms of enforcement and so on. So I think a lot of capacity and resources is needed for the ministry as well. And in addition to that, also for the consumers, I mean, we talk about, you know, monitoring and surveillance and enforcement and prosecution by the ministry, but at the same time, the consumers themselves, because automatically now the consumers will be very guarded, they'll be very afraid and afraid that, you know, the burden will come to them. So we need to then educate the consumers. We need to then empower the consumers that, you know, for them to understand that not necessarily that all, rationalization of subsidies will end up where the consumers bear the burden. Because as we know, especially when we're talking about the diesel subsidies, there's not much of impact because it's very limited to certain sectors only, where we're talking about the fisher folks, the agriculture, smallholders, and then the logistical companies. So it's very focused to a small group of people. Right. So the consumers need to understand that when an errant trader says, hey, I'm doing this because, you know, the diesel subsidy is gone. So, you know, everything has gone up. So the consumer must be able, you know, to argue and say, hey, I know about the rationalization of, you know, the diesel subsidy. There is no impact because the logistical companies or the distribution companies, you know, are getting the necessary support. So which means there should not be any increase in price. So you can't increase any price. They must be able to vocalize their rights, you know, to these errant traders. And I think that's what's also needed. So I think what is important is that the federal government, I hope that, you know, with the savings, the potential savings of RM4 billion from this exercise would be allocated both to the Ministry of Domestic Trade, so that, you know, enough resources is there for the officers to do the monitoring, to do the enforcement, to do the prosecution, as well as to the consumer movement as well, because I think this is where we can support the government in terms of educating the consumers, because we need to go all out. We need to go to all the respective, states in Peninsula here to ensure that the consumers are educated. This is what we actually did similarly in 2014 when GST was being implemented, when the government decided to, you know, implement GST in 2014-15. The consumer groups were given a special allocation to go out and educate the consumers on why, what is a GST, what is the implication on consumers, how can consumers be empowered to now make the right choice, when they are spending their funds or their income on essential items. So I think that's where I hope that, you know, the 4 billion savings would be used to actually, support both the ministry as well as the consumers.
So on the consumer, on the part that the consumer can play in defending themselves against these potentially rogue traders, number one, what's their first line of defense? What can they do when they, let's say, find themselves in a situation where they think that they're being charged for more than it's worth, than the good is worth, and potentially, you know, the trader is taking advantage of the rationalization exercise?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, first they need to understand what is the implication of this exercise. That there should not be any, unjustifiable price hike, on goods and services, especially, on the food that they are purchasing at the supermarkets or grocery stores, or even on vegetables and other products. So first, they need to first have that knowledge, I think, with them, that there is no implication. Number two, they must be able to voice out, they must be able to take action and tell the errant traders, this is not right. They must call them out and say that, that if you are doing this, I am, number one, going to inform my, if the grocery store is somewhere within the residential area of that particular consumer, then this is where, word of mouth is very important. So this is where the consumer can say, hey, I'm going to say to the rest of the residents here, not to frequent your shop, because I have the right to choose. And here now you are increasing your price. I am going to go either to the next nearest grocery store and tell my family members, tell my neighbors that not to frequent your store. So I think we need to ensure the consumers now need to take that extra step. It's not only enough for the consumers to be aware, but they need to take that extra step and actually take action. So number one is to be assertive, to tell the errant trader, what you are doing is not right, So I am going to tell my fellow friends, my fellow, residents here, not to frequent your shop. I am going to go to another shop and tell them to do the same. And number two, to actually lodge complaints.
Right.
And I think this is where, the consumer movement and also the Ministry of Domestic Trade, we have always been encouraging consumers that it is through your complaints we can change business practices. So for example, the ministry has various channels. I think on their website of the Ministry of Domestic Trade, consumers can lodge complaints either through their hotline and so on, through various ways. But also for the consumer movement under FOMCA, we actually have an organization called the National Consumer Complaints Center, where we take complaints not only on prices, but across 23 different sectors. So we have our portal where consumers can actually go to the National Consumer Complaints Center, which is www.nccc.org.my, and they can click on e-Aduan and actually lodge their complaint. They can also call us on 0378771076 and also, kind of inquire on how they can actually lodge this complaint. And so for us, we collect these complaints as well. And we actually try to see why these complaints are coming about, because many a times the government comes up with very good policies, very good laws, but sometimes we still see a lot of complaints. And for us, it's more on not the numbers, but we want to know why these complaints are happening. Is it because of lack of enforcement, or is it because of an errant business practice? And this is what we usually feed then to the government to, to ensure that there are some changes and that the consumers are protected in a better way. So I would say that for the consumers, once they get that knowledge, that they become much more vocalized, and tell off the errant trader that you are not supposed to hike the price because there's no implication whatsoever. And number two, to say that I would then go by word of mouth and tell others not to frequent your shop, so you basically go find another shop, you shop around and look for a better where the prices are still the same. And number three is to basically to lodge complaints.
Right. Now, because you mentioned, from your experience, you've dealt with complaints, and sometimes you want to try and figure out, why it is happening. And you mentioned two things. It's either a lack of enforcement, or that it's just because of the fact that there are errant traders. From your experience, which one is it usually the case?
Well, I think it's a mixture of both. It's a mixture of both in the sense that many a times, when we're talking, today we're talking about issue of subsidy and price hikes. But we have found that many a times that the current complaints that we receive sometimes doesn't fall exactly within the current law. And sometimes there's a need to actually amend the law. Some of the laws, have been there since time immemorial. You have laws which are in the 70s and 80s, and technological advances have happened. So sometimes the cases are where the laws need to be updated. And so sometimes that's why that at the moment the business it says, hey, I don't have to adhere because nothing makes it mandatory for me to to adhere to that particular provision. And so that's why we find sometimes that the law may be obsolete and needs to be updated. There are times that some of the cases fall within the jurisdiction of different ministries. Then again, it's like a joint, joint ministerial kind of enforcement that is needed. So it's not just one ministry. Sometimes you will need the joint enforcement of two ministries. And this is where sometimes, which ministry kind of has the power or the punca kuasa at the end of the day. So, the one ministry will say, oh no, it's not my jurisdiction, it's the other ministry. So this is where now sometimes, NCC comes in and we try to then have discussions and dialogues with the relevant ministries to say that, you may have to have a joint task force of both ministries taking action. So this is where we find, and most of the time, sometimes the law is there, but the businesses just don't want to adhere. So NCC, of course, we are merely mediators. So we play a mediating role. But of course, when you complain to the ministry, the ministry then takes, action. They can actually take action. But not all issues fall under the Ministry of Domestic Trade. And that's why sometimes, we, as I mentioned, we take cases that goes beyond the Ministry of Domestic Trade and the consumer protection laws. And that's why we try to then channel the relevant complaints to the relevant ministries so that they can then take action. Or we then advise the consumers, go to the tribunal, the consumer tribunal, and actually get your redress at that level. So this is where we find that sometimes it's a mixture. There's no kind of one size fits all. Sometimes, as I say, it's lack of enforcement. And that's where then we give enough cases to the relevant ministry and say, hey, we find that, the law is sufficient, but then, nobody is actually looking at whether these businesses are actually doing what they are saying that they are doing. So can you, enhance your enforcement in that sense? Yeah, so it's a mixture of all, I would say.
Just to go back to an earlier point that you raised, since the diesel subsidy rationalisation doesn't quite wouldn't have quite the same impact as, say, later on when the RON 95 subsidies come in, the rationalisation of the subsidies come in. So are you, in other words, saying or implying that perhaps for now it's kind of manageable, that you can see it's not going to really be much of a problem in terms of, prices being jacked up by errant traders? But let's say further on, when the RON 95 subsidies are rationalised, is this going to be much more a problem? And are we going to see more complaints coming in then?
Yes, I think definitely has been. I think this is why I find that it's very crucial for the federal government to ensure that actually consumers are made aware of the impact. Many a times you find that consumers, especially low-income consumers, B40, especially in those in the rural areas, many of them actually rely on diesel, fuel, not only for their vehicles, but also sometimes for the generator. Sometimes if there are, electricity shortages and so on. And then when you talk about farmers, fisher folks, they are all mostly in the coastal and rural, remote areas. And that's why I feel that at this moment where there is not much of impact on the consumers, this is actually the right time. This is definitely the right time for us to start educating and raising awareness, raise awareness of the consumers. Then what does this rationalization of subsidy mean? It doesn't mean taking away subsidy, but it means of making it much more efficient, so that there are no leakages and that there should not be any impact on especially the low income consumers. And so consumers need to understand, because the moment when the word subsidy and rationalization or removal, the word comes out, automatically consumers tend to think, oh my God, prices are going to go high. That's the automatic kind of I would say knee-jerk reaction that consumers get. And I think that's why when we know now at the moment, I think economists have also mentioned that, the government has also mentioned that they are ensuring that there is no impact or very, very low impact on the consumers in terms of the diesel rationalization subsidy. This is the best time for us to actually educate the consumers. And that's why I say that, whatever savings there is, there has to be that kind of, rollout by the government, to ensure that consumers are educated and they are then well prepared when the RON 95 rationalization subsidy happens, because by then they would be able to, be much more, well aware, and they are much more be able to advocate to, or, assert themselves to say that, okay, what is the price hike? Why is it so high? If it's only, 5 cent increase or 10-cent increase, why is, now a cup of, coffee or a cup of drink so high, 1 ringgit extra, I can report you under the, Price Control and Anti-Profiteering Act. I can go to the ministry, I can complain to them. So they must be able to say that. And that's why I feel that the moment is now to start raising awareness. Of course, coming up with media statements is fine, but when you talk about, the rural areas and all that, that's where we really need to go out. We really need to go to the schools, to the universities, to residents associations, to many of the JKKs. And I think, the consumer groups are much more well equipped because we are always with the people. And, this is where we need to work with the government, with the local authority, with the Ministry of Domestic Trade and their, branches on how we can do this. So that when RON 95 comes in, we are much more prepared and there is no lasting, negative impact to the consumers.
Okay. So I guess we're kind of coming to the end of the interview. So you've made it very clear about what consumers should do to better protect themselves, play more of a role, be more vocal, and essentially, I think you're advocating for more empowerment on the part of the consumer. Other than that, I just wanted to round off our discussion for today. Between the two, obviously I think the forefront or the front runner for the mechanisms that the government will be using will be the fleet cards. But you've also got the cash transfer through the monthly diesel aid, the 200 ringgit monthly aid. Between these two, cash transfers, fleet cards, which one are you? Personally, are you a fan of, and you think is more efficient at targeting the income groups?
Well, I think it has to be a combination of both. Cash transfers is basically, I would say that it is for the low income, that's always useful because they can actually then use these funds to, whether it's for diesel or for petrol, they can also use it for other purposes. And as we know, if we look at many of the, reports that have been coming out in the media, many of our consumers, especially nowadays since post-COVID, you can see that people are not having proper meals. Many of them saying that one meal per day is already something that what I can afford. There have been even reports of people not having nutritious meals, not even only one meal, but sometimes it's not even a nutritious meal full of carbs. And that has got implication again on the health of our people, of the population. So for me, I find that these are all, it's like a domino effect. When you talk about, if we do not do this right, then there'll be that impact that if I would say it has to be a combination of both. It has to have the cash transfer, but you would also then have to have some sort of this fleet card kind of thing for for the bigger companies and so on, but also for the smaller public transportation, for the smaller vehicles, the SMEs. They would need this, because when you talk about the logistical companies, of course you have the big ones and you have the small ones, but the ones that are carting agricultural products are the smaller companies. So we need to have a combination, I would say, of both. But I think more importantly, I would say it's the monitoring and the enforcement. I would still emphasize on that. Whatever mechanism that is in place, as I said, there is always bound to be abuse. Whenever the word subsidy is there, there is always bound to be abuse. So to ensure that we curb, the subsidy, we have to ensure that there is monitoring, there's surveillance, and there's enforcement, and there's prosecution. We need to ensure all these four elements are there, because just enforcement is not enough, because you have to enforce, you come out in the media, but you don't take any action. Then many of these companies say, oh, it's okay, I just get fined. You need to imprison many of them if they are blatantly, either, going against the law, because we do have the laws already in place. So it's not a matter of not having the laws. So it's a matter of just enforcement. So for me, I would say that, you'll have to have both, the cash transfer for those very, very low income, for those who are actually producing the food for our nation, the food security, because if we do not give them that kind of support, we are going to get food, food which is full of carbs, and then we're going to have a nation. Already we are now, if you look at the recent mobility and health survey, more than 50% of our consumers are obese or overweight, and we have at least 2 to 3 NCDs, many of them, at least 50% of them. So that's really very, it's not a very good statistics or something that for us to be proud of. So I think in terms of those who are providing us essential food, essential goods, essential services, they must be provided with both. But to ensure that there is no abuse, there has to be a quota system, there has to be that monitoring. And that's why I say that, sometimes officers may not be, enough to ensure that, the enforcement is in place. That's where the consumer groups can do, mystery shopping, where we go in and, kind of pretend to be, certain. So there's many ways that we can actually support the government. And as I said, when GST was implemented in 2014-15, we supported the government by going all out and educating the consumers. So I hope that the federal government will look into it to ensure that how some of these funds can be, channeled to the Ministry of Domestic Trade for them to ensure that they have the necessary resources in place, and for the consumer groups to support the government in empowering the consumers.
Right. Thank you so much, Dato. I think you've given very comprehensive insights into the measures that the government has already put in place, and what needs to be done more, especially on the part of the consumer. So thank you so much for your time and speaking to us on Beyond the Headlines. Dato' Indrani Turaisingam, the FOMCA Vice President, for our viewers at home. Stay tuned, everyone, because there's more coming up after this in our second segment. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So now with me in the studio is transport consultant and former Land Public Transport Commission, or SPAD, Head of Policy Planning, Wan Agil, Wan Hassan, to talk about all things VEP. Agil, wonderful to have you back.
Thank you for having me back.
Thank you for coming back. Now, on the vehicle entry permits for all foreign cars entering from Singapore, right?
Yep.
The MOT records show that 70,000 Singapore registered motor vehicles have registered and activated the VEP tag, compared to over 200,000 motor vehicles that have registered but haven't yet completed the full installation and activation process of their VEP tags. Can you explain why this is so?
Well, to be honest with you, I have no explanation on why the rest of the 200,000 vehicles are not completed the registration processes. We know for a fact that it started back in 2019, right? Mm-hmm. And we have 70,000 actively using VEPs, meaning that it's working,
right?
And it's functional. So it's up to the government now to really enforce the law, if the law is there in place, or perhaps improve the capacity and capability of the agencies that responsible on getting all this balance of 130,000 fleets or 130,000 vehicles to complete their registrations. Mm-hmm. Because without this VEP full implementations, then we're not going to solve the congestion problems at the causeway. So having VEP is good, but having it half baked, it's not really. It should raise a lot of eyebrows at the federal administrations.
I mean, the reason why there have been delays in the full enforcement of this is because Transport Minister Anthony Locke said there were setbacks, there were delays since the implementation of the VEP tags in 2019. Do you know exactly what sort of delays they were? Although he sort of alluded to the fact that it was because of COVID and there were not much of border crossings because of the pandemic. But yeah, can you specify
I think it can be a fair reasons mentioned by the YB ministers of Minister of Transport to I'm not going to say blame, but to say that the COVID situation that caused the delays. But I think we opened our borders back in 2022, right? If I'm not mistaken. And until today, which is 2 years since we opened up our borders, it should be enough in a sense of timeline for us to complete the whole exercise for VEP implementations. Right. So my best guess is not only about COVID, but the priority that the government has at the moment in regards to solving the problem at the causeway, and also the capacity and capabilities of the immigration and maybe our Ministry of Transport that caused the delays. Now, we need to be very specific about it. If the priority is to have VEP full force implemented by 2025, for example, if that's the target, then that priority must be given to complete the whole 200,000 vehicles registration for VEP. Right. We only have 70,000 fleets. Now the balance of 130,000 should be completed within this year, so that we have that 200,000 vehicles completed the VEP registration and they can start using the VEP. That will definitely give a significant impact towards the causeway congestion situations.
On congestion, right, at the causeway, we know there's a lot of issues going on with the immigration. One being the immigration staff there. There's just not enough people working there. I mean, that's one of the issues that both the MB and the Immigration Department has addressed. But can you just give us an idea so that we can understand like how congested it is? The amount of cars that go through the borders in the south daily. How many cars are we talking about daily here?
I don't have the exact figures, but you can imagine the daily trips that happen in between Johor and Singapore are going to be hundreds of thousands. This is not to mention. This also including those who are using buses, motorcycles, besides cars, right? So the congestion on the ground, it's real. And I can see the state government of Johor is quite desperate when you can, you can recall there are so many incidents where the chief ministers of Johor went to the ground and being very vocal about it, because the congestion is real and it really give an impact to the to the productivity of Johor. So if we have delays because of the congestion in Causeway, both Singapore and Johor will definitely feel the impacts. But most of the important things highlighted by the MB of Johor is the performance of the CIQ itself, that manned by the immigration department. And you can simply, if you can go online, especially on TikToks, right? There's even a question, a simple question by the MB said that where are these immigration officers? Why there are so many counters but only little operations counter operate? So it goes back to the responsibility of immigration officers to man all the counters, beside having the right solutions to solve the congestion problems. But that basic need to be addressed first, because you want this is an active borders. I think it's one of the most busiest border in Southeast Asia, when
in
it
the
comes
world,
to,
I think.
and in fact in the world. So you cannot have it's like a minimum capacity to satisfy that needs. We need maximum capacity. Now the real question to us, do we have a capacity issue, or if it's a capability issue, most of the time the capability issue can be resolved by technology. The technology is available. It's just a matter of time for us to install and implement it. But if the capacity issues is not addressed, then we have a real problem. It doesn't matter what kind of technology you use, but if the capacity issue remain the main issues, the main challenge, then we really have a problem that need to be considered seriously by the government.
Do you think we have an influx, an issue with an influx of cars passing through our borders, which leads to this problem?
Possible. See, Johor has become quite attractive in the sense of economic corridors. With the implementations of the free trade zones, for example, will definitely attract a lot of businesses from Singapore to come to Johor. So influx, yes. And I think the state government, including the federal government, is addressing it by building RTS, which is going to be implemented and in operations by next year, if I'm not mistaken. And not to mention about RTS, we also have the state government to at least settle down with the implementation of ART to support RTS. Then you can have, maybe when RTS is implemented, that influx can be diverted to use rail services, and then they can start their journey using LRT that has been agreed by principle by the Dewan Undangan Negeri of Johor. So yeah, I mean, influx is possible.
Okay. And from this influx, do you think that this has been because there's a smuggling issue of sorts? Do you think this is something you can go into?
I don't have any intelligence on that, to be honest with you, but by logic, it's a bit hard to say, because we are talking about Singapore and Malaysia, right? So that border is quite critical, if I would say, not only for our side but also from the Singapore side. So it's not that simple to say that there's a smuggling issues that caused influx.
Okay, fair enough. I just brought it up because I remember reading news about private vehicles sort of modified to be able to carry contraband. We're talking about drugs. Not necessarily in the biggest amounts, but enough to warrant.
But I think like I mentioned, right? This is Singapore border to Johor border, right? If we see, I mean, I'm not saying that I'm not being biased, but if we read on the reports, we might have that kind of problem on the north border rather than the south border.
Right. Okay.
So I think it's fair to say that it's not as simple as that to say there is an influx because of the contraband delivery. But I would say I would just bank it on the growth of the economy. That's why the influx is going it's happened.
Right. I suppose it's more of for a border agency department or
address
the
it, yeah.
immigration department to
Yeah,
address
of course.
that question. Yes. Now with the VEP, again on somewhat border security and immigration, is this another added layer of security for our borders?
I think, in a sense of security layers, it is something that we should consider seriously, because having VEP will definitely allow us to have all the data required for us to monitor and at least enforce certain laws.
Right.
And I wouldn't see it as a layer that create more bureaucracy, but I think I would say that it's a security layer that we definitely need in order for us to be better in managing our borders. Then VEP will be necessary layers of security.
Now, the full enforcement of the VEP and road charge will soon extend up to our border in the north, at the Malaysian-Thai border soon too. Anthony Locke, the MOT minister, says that the government has already invested 150 million ringgit into the implementation of the VEP at the Johor-Singapore border. While that may be the case for the border in the south, the expenses for any operational costs for implementing the system and issuance of the permits up in the north later on will have to be borne completely by interested parties. The government will not incur any operational costs, is what he's saying essentially. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this a matter of budgeting? Is there not enough in the coffers for the government?
Okay, to have the government to extend the VEP implementation to the northern border, especially Malaysian-Thailand border, right? I think it's a good call by the Ministry of Transport because it is time for us to at least revolutionize and put the right technology at our borders, as I mentioned just now. A necessary security layers for us to track, to have the data, to further analyze the data of movement and things like that. So having that to be implemented in Malaysia-Thailand border, I applaud for it.
Right.
Now, the part that I a bit concerned is when the Ministry of Transport mentioned about the budget or the cost of building and implementing these kind of solutions at the borders should be borne by the interested party. So when it comes to this, I'm a bit critical because this border infrastructure is a strategic infrastructure for the government. We can see it as a security and safety, high security and safety infrastructure that need to be controlled by the government. I know that even though there is a interested party who are happy to come in and fund the infrastructure development for this, border, but again, it comes to a question of liability and responsibility because number one is that there should be standard SOPs and regulations that need to be implemented at the border. The government has that power. So the relationship between government and the operators will be very difficult to streamline because the operators will definitely not have enough. I mean, they don't have any local standard to implement or enforce our law. That's number one. Number two is the how to operate it, how to operate the VEP system, because most of the time, all the activities at the CIQ is government process and government activities. Right. So how these operators, let's say for the argument's sake, how will this operator operate that? So you want them to build it, but there must be a return of investment to whoever want to build it, right? So I invest money, so there must be some sort like a return investment because it's going to be my cost. So is it going to be a subscription model by the government, or are we going to charge the whoever use the VEP system, or are we going to charge certain fees to maybe immigration department? I mean, that model need to be explored and agreed upon. Not by the government and the vendors or operators, but by everyone in the parliament because it related to our security, border security. That's number two. And number three, it's a classic example of LRT 1998, right? I would say this, I've said it out loud when it comes to HSR implementations when the government want
Yes.
to, fully privatize the whole development. You have this key strategic infrastructure that you cannot let it be dormant. 1998, we have LRT built by private sectors. And then they cash out, they declare bankrupt, and then the government during Tun Mahathir's time, I think Tun Mahathir's asked PNB to take over the whole operations. I think about 80%
Right.
of the equity, because the government cannot allow the LRT for not moving, right? So the same concern I have with HSR when government want to privatize it and give it 100% for private funding.
Yep.
So whether or not it's going to be a viable model, and the same thing might happen to the one that they want to do, the CIQ that they want to build with the VEP technology and solutions in border of Thailand and Malaysia. So let's say this interested party want to build it, they built it, and then they reach certain ROI threshold, and then they want to cash out. So what will happen then?
Right.
So there are so many factors, there are so many variables, and there are so many scenarios that need to be considered by the government before they come up with the idea of allowing interested party to come in and build it privately. But I believe somehow government need to be responsible, whether it's a government guarantee or maybe we want to explore PPP, for example. But government need to be involved. Government need to be an equivalent players in this whole
Right.
spectrum of allowing other people to come in and build it for the government. So, and it's not a new model, right? PPP is something that we have done for so many times. So yeah, I mean that's my view on the announcement by the minister.
So if this is a matter of how much the government can gain from the ROI, do you think that the bulk of the costs will eventually be borne by the user, the people like you and I, who will be looking to buy these permits?
I think it's not wrong to charge certain amount to the users, right? Because at the end of the day, the user will enjoy a very efficient system when it comes to border transfer. I mean, to border movement. So before this, perhaps they face long waiting time to make sure that they can come into Malaysia, or maybe congestion like what happened in Causeway of Johor and Singapore. But having the VEP technology or whatever technology that you want to implement at the border area will allow efficient service to happen and allow shorter waiting time. And that's what we want, right? Shorter waiting time so that congestion will never happen. And if that particular scenario can happen, I think it's quite okay for the government to charge the user. But again, it need to be at an acceptable sum, or at least an affordable sum,
Right.
that will not shy away those who want to travel to Malaysia, because we need to also consider the impact of charging particular sum to the user of the CIQ.
Could this possibly then push away, since you said that you don't want to scare off people from coming in?
Yeah, definitely.
Could this possibly scare away people coming and potential tourists who can bring in more?
I don't think so, because as long as, like I said just now, as long as the sum is acceptable and affordable, it just another cost of travel to the user. Say, let's say some people might not be interested in flying from Thailand to Malaysia, right? And they are willing to travel by car or by buses. And of course, the charges that they want to charge on the car user and a bus passenger will be definitely different.
Yep.
And those who think that it will be cheaper if I travel by bus, then they will travel by bus. And those who want to enjoy the flexibility, the privacy, or maybe the luxury of driving on their own, then they will opt in to drive their own vehicle, and they will be charged differently. So again, at some point, we still need to let it be to the economic situations, let the economy drive this. But again, it need to be carefully designed so that the scenario where we shying away those people from using or traveling to Malaysia will not happen, because tourism is one of the key economic generators for the country, and that particular part of charging the user, if the government want to charge, will need to be weighed properly by every stakeholders in the country.
Right. And to make sure that that is the case, what do you think is the best way or the ideal mechanism of the permit issuance once it's more sort of once it's extended to the north, and now we have all the borders implementing this? What's the best way to go about it?
I think VEP is still the best way to go about it.
Okay.
It's pretty much straightforward. It's tested solutions in the south border. It's just a matter of us to up our game to ensure that the south border is completed and every single vehicle that registered already using it. But of course, we can explore other technology like QR code. I believe there is a discussion about it, using QR code as one of the technology solutions. But we need to be very careful when we look into this new technology, because the most important thing is for us to be able to gather the data, analyze the data. If we have solutions where it didn't give us enough, and then it's going to be very difficult for us to manage, especially in monitoring the movement of the people at our borders. I know and I'm aware there is a solution called dynamic QR as well that will allow you to have a very significant data behind it, meaning that you can decide what kind of data that you can gather or you can get from that particular transaction. But I don't think there is many available in the market. I know there are a couple of companies have it, but government can always call for RFP and get them to present that solutions, and perhaps having it as an option, running it together with VEP to allow other people to have options to use certain technology solutions at the border.
So this dynamic QR code, how much better is it than your normal QR code?
I think if I got it right, the dynamic QR code will allow you to have a fixed data set by the government, right? That will not allow other people to tamper it, so that you have the information of the user, the charges that you charge, maybe the plate numbers, the origin of the journey. I mean, you can design the whole data set that you want from that particular transaction, as compared as a normal QR, right? Sometimes when you go for normal QR, there are data which is not available, and when it comes to the back end data management, then they are missing data that you will not be able to capture. Most of the time, the data using a normal QR, again, I'm no expert in this, right? But based on my readings and chat with some of the technology provider, they will only give you certain amount of data or certain types of data. But with dynamic QR, that will allow you to have more confirmed data on what you need. But again, like I said, I'm no expert, but government can always explore this by calling for RFP and see how many players in the market that are able to give the solutions to the government. And again, it goes back to the objective of having additional technology to allow people to have options, or at least a backup to the VEP, just in case if something happened to VEP, then we have another option. Maybe I can make a comparison, or it might not be an apple-to-apple comparison, but let's talk about our tool system, right?
Yes.
So we have multiple ways of using our tool system when it comes to payment. We have the touch and go card, we have the smart tag, we have the RFID, and latest we have the OPR.
Yes.
So it's not something new to have options. It's better to have options instead, rather than relying on one system, which is not going to be a very strategic move by the government.
As it is right now, I think a lot of people will agree with me that even with the RFID, which is probably the latest technology we have in terms of the how we collect the toll fee, it's still very problematic. Sometimes it does cause congestions when it doesn't work as well, not as efficient. I've been in that situation quite a few times. Do you think we actually have the resources to carry out this, seemingly, I mean, to me it sounds really good. I mean, it sounds good on paper, the dynamic QR code. Do we actually have the resources for this?
I think if when you use RFID as a case study, right? I think it's fair to say that we cannot just simply blame touch and go, and also we cannot simply blame the toll operators, because there are so many vulnerable parts in the whole implementations of RFID. If I can just mention, for example, the responsibility to install certain devices at the toll booth, if I'm not mistaken, it's not the responsibility of touch and go. It's the responsibility of highway operators, if I'm not mistaken, and if I got it right. And there are certain requirements that they need to meet. For example, the bandwidth of the internet connection that they need to have at certain minimum, right? But at some point, the operators are not able to meet that minimum requirement. So not only that, perhaps the way they built it, the way they install the devices is not according to the requirements set by touch and go, for example. So, like I said, there are so many parts that need to be, scrutinized when it comes to inefficiency of implementation, RFID implementation. So, using that case study, it should be a lesson learned to the government when it comes to introducing new technology to our borders. Meaning that we need to have one responsible party when it comes to the installations or maybe installations of the technology or maybe the system installations that need to be only one party responsible to it so that there's not many players in the process. And if we can address whatever faced by the toll operators or the toll operations and use it as a lesson learned for our borders, CIQ and VEP implementation, then it should be fine. It should be fine.
And just one last thing before we wrap up. Speaking of operators, vendors, there's a lot of money, investment here and profit to be gained out of this, right? This is going to be a huge project once it extends to the north as well.
Yeah.
Do you see maybe a big monopoly, by certain big players in the industry coming up?
This is a bit tricky because when it comes to monopoly, you need to see it in two different angles, whether it's a good monopoly or it's a bad monopoly. Let's go back to the highway operations and toll operation, right? Touch and go used to be the monopoly.
Yeah.
It's good because they have the right technology at the right time. But along the way, there are new technology coming up.
Right.
And of course, having touch and go to monopolize everything is no longer acceptable. Hence why the government introduced the open payment system that allow other players to come in like Visa and MasterCard. Same goes to the border infrastructure. If we have if we have the technology provider that is good and reliable, and also perhaps is a very niche technology, then having the monopoly might be acceptable at this point. But again, technology innovations happen every day, right? So if government says that we need monopoly to implement this, then it's going to be very difficult for government to justify it because, like I said, technology innovations happen every day, and VEP QR code solutions is not a rocket science. So having a monopoly is out of the question. In the future, I believe that it is very important for government to do open tender, like what happened to HSR. And it shouldn't be any closed tender or direct nego implementation when it comes to dealing with the border infrastructure. In fact, it should be as open as possible because we are talking about a very a very significant infrastructure that related to our border security. Right. So we need to be very open as possible.
So ideally, a player that has been established for some time.
It depends. I wouldn't say that new players cannot come in, but again, the way we design the tender should be very careful. We need to be very critical. Having the new player to come in is not something that we should just reject it outright, but perhaps we can put certain requirement in it. For example, if they are the new player, perhaps they are the new player that coming in with the set of expertise, but they might need to partner up with another player to complete or complement the whole solutions. Maybe that is the requirement that government can put, but like I said, it depends on how government design the tender. But it need to be very critical. It need to be very detailed.
All right. Thank you. Thank you
No
so
problem.
much for that.
Thank you for having me.
Look forward to having you on soon again.
I hope
perhaps,
so.
If we can talk more about the VP, that would be great.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Agil, for your time on
Thank
Beyond
you
the
very much
Headlines.
again.
Well, everyone, that's all for this week's show. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel here at NST Online. Don't forget to also follow us on all the socials, Facebook, Instagram, and X for all the updates and news. Be sure to turn on that notification bell so that you never miss out. Well, that's it from me. Thank you for watching. This has been Beyond the Headlines, episode 40. I'm Haswin Hassan. Until next time, it's goodbye.